Well, please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, here you are, the happy few. I am delighted that you're joining us here on this Independence Day weekend. And what a weekend of customs it is in our country. We have our cookouts. If there's any national pastime on this weekend, it is to go outside and grill hamburgers and hot dogs. I wonder what George Washington would think about that. We have fireworks. We have red, white, and blue scattered everywhere. Although, as was once pointed out to me, the flag code says you're not really supposed to wear the red, white, and blue on clothing, but we won't get too particular about that. I was also a little bit appalled the other day. I have a confession to make. I was up with my nieces in New Hampshire. And on Thursday, as I was talking about July 4th, I asked my youngest niece, I said, well, how many of the patriotic songs do you know? And she knew none of them. Didn't even know the national anthem. And I was like, oh, Uncle John has got to teach you a lesson. Although she somehow found a way to be absent the next day and not be around for the lessons. But part of that did get me thinking, and I'm sure you've thought about this too, that in our nation, one of the things that's important is to talk about history. And since you know, or at least most of you know, how much I love history, today I get to be a total history dork, and now you are stuck in the pews in this cold air conditioning to have to listen. This is important because as someone who values history, I realize how impactful history is to our lives. Our institutions, whether they be churches or other institutions, our families, our nation, our state, our denomination, all of these things are greatly dependent upon the past and things that came before. Especially founding narratives get in the DNA of a people, of an institution. And so it's important to remind ourselves about that DNA so that we can learn what it means to be good Americans, in the case of this church, good Hills Church members, good Congregationalists, good Massachusetts people. Now, as I'm sure you probably realize, the American Revolution is unlike any other revolution that I'm aware of in history. In other revolutions, you had people who were greatly oppressed, who then revolted in some way or another. There were deprivations and sufferings. You look at the famous French Revolution. You look at the Russian Revolution. You look at the revolution in China with Mao Zedong. You look at other revolutionary movements or independence movements throughout world history. One common denominator is that people in those situations were oppressed. That was not true of the 13 colonies. In fact, it could not have been further from the truth. At the time of independence, the American colonists were the most prosperous, the most free, the most equal, the most literate of any people anywhere on the planet. It is an odd thing indeed that the American colonies fought a very bloody war in order to gain our independence. And the question is why? If things were going so well in the 13 colonies, if life was so good, if there were not deprivations and suffering in the 13 colonies, why on earth did people go through all of that in order to have a revolution? This is where, for all the different reasons that historians have put out for the cause of the American Revolution, whether it be sociological causes or economic causes, the cause that I find most compelling, and I think many people find most compelling, is that our revolution was fundamentally an ideological revolution. It was ideas that gave birth to our nation. And so as we consider the birth of our nation, it's important to know what were those ideas that were so influential, that led people to lay down their lives on behalf of them. Why did they matter so much? Broadly speaking, there were three great intellectual traditions that gave the foundation for these ideas that led to the revolution. And it's important to walk through them because they're very different from our own intellectual foundations. The first was the histories of ancient Rome. This probably wouldn't be the first thing that comes to your mind when you think about the revolution, But the reality is anyone who got educated in the 18th century, their education consisted of studying Latin and, if they progressed far enough, studying Greek. Anyone who went to any of the universities, Harvard, or say colleges at the time, Harvard College, Yale College, William and Mary College, anyone who went to these places were deeply imbued with Latin and Greek authors. And when you look at the revolutionary pamphlets, they're simply littered with references to ancient Rome. And there are a few key authors they would read. They would read Livy, they would read Tacitus, Plutarch, they would read also Cicero. And some of the lessons they derived from this were, first, you had this situation when you look at the decline of the Roman Republic. Why did the Roman Republic collapse? It collapsed in part because of the existence of a standing army. For the first time, the Roman Republic went from being a volunteer army to being a professional army. That happened during the time of Gaius Marius, and then that led to the fall of the Roman Republic. People at the time of the revolution were deeply suspect of any standing army because of its capacity to corrupt. Another thing they were aware of, you read in Livy, Livy looks back at the early days of Rome and talks about the virtue of the Roman people. When George Washington, after 2 terms in office, voluntarily stepped aside and went back to go become a gentleman farmer again, what was the society that his officers made in his honor? Society of the Cincinnati, named after Cincinnatus, this great figure that Livy talks about, who, after being dictator of Rome and rescuing the Roman Republic, went back to being a farmer in the countryside. The values of virtue and these Roman values of virtue and the decline of that virtue is what people saw as being the decline of Rome. These things mattered tremendously. Another tradition that built on that was the 18th century tradition and 17th century traditions in England. These Enlightenment thinkers and also writers on politics that people here in the country would read. And they were particular themes that kept coming up again and again. One of the themes that came up was this theme that goes back to the Magna Carta and deeply embedded in the English Constitution. And that is, to raise revenue, you need a consent of the people. Again, that goes back to the Magna Carta in the 13th century. This was a huge deal during the 17th century and the fight with King Charles that led to the founding of Massachusetts. That if you raise revenue, you need the consent of the people, otherwise it's tyranny because they could just take away everything you have. This was a core value of the English Constitution. Another core value that people talked about is the nature of power is to want more power. People in the Revolutionary era were incredibly aware of this. They were inherently suspect of power. Wherever power was, power is just, it's this hungry beast that keeps eating and devouring everything around it. Power must be resisted at all costs. That's why you had in the English Constitution these balance of powers that were talked about specifically after the Glorious Revolution of 1688. The glories of the English Constitution in the 18th century was the balance of powers, and when this gets out of whack, then liberty is under threat. One of the things that holds that power in check was the value of courts and the court system and the judiciary. These things were written about again and again and again throughout the 18th century. Another important influence, of course, is John Locke. And I know many of you are like, John Locke, yes, I remember reading Second Treatise on Government way back in the day. What's important about that? Locke theorizes that government, he goes back to the state of nature. He said, but back before there was any government at all, and human beings were just in a state of nature, what is the origin of government? People got together and formed a contract with one another where they would give up a portion of their property and a portion of their liberty to protect the rest of their liberty and their property. You can see the echoes of this, of course, in the famous preamble of the Declaration of Independence. What's interesting about Lockean form of government is that it's based on a contract, and when that contract is violated, then it gives you grounds to dissolve the contract and have something else. Again, hence the preamble of the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Paine, in his great work, Common Sense, the most influential work for the coming of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, Thomas Paine in Common Sense used Lockean contract theory of government to argue against kings. He said, in this original state of nature, there's no place for kings. A final strand, and one that's particularly relevant for us, is, of course, Christianity. and Protestantism. This was hugely influential. While not everyone had the privilege of going to college, very few did. While very few people even went through what we would consider high school, a Latin grammar school, every single person was in church. And they all heard about church stuff every single Sunday. If there was any influence intellectually on people at that time, it were churches. They were incredibly afraid of any hierarchical power in churches, especially the Congregationalists. At the time of the Revolution, there were no bishops in the 13 colonies. There were no Catholic bishops. There were no Anglican bishops anywhere in the 13 colonies. So even the Anglican churches had a huge degree of self-determination that would not have been present in England. There was a sense coming out of the churches of everyone being created in the image and likeness of God. It has been argued, I would say convincingly, that democracy itself grew out of the Protestant Reformation. This idea that you are equal before God and you have to think for yourself and salvation is individual, there is this sense that emerges out of that undergirds democracy. You also had this covenant view in the churches. God makes a covenant with Israel. The Congregationalists, what makes a congregational church? A congregational church, the covenant that people share. It was this covenant theology and these views on equality that were heavily influential for John Locke. Another big thing coming out of the church tradition was the inherent sinfulness of human beings. Human beings are inherently sinful, therefore you need to set up government in order to protect against the sins of human beings. Of course, human beings, if you give the option to do the bad option, humans will take the bad option 10 times out of 10. They had a very dark view on human nature back then. So when the US Constitution was formed, you had to protect against the sins of humanity that would show up again and again. Many people here in the United States saw themselves in with the people of Israel, particularly in New England. Insofar as they are virtuous, insofar as they are godly, God will reward them. When that contract is broken, bad things will occur. And this is the framework then when you look at the famous events of the 1760s and 1770s, this is the framework that gave rise to our independence. The reality is the demands of England were actually not that big a deal. And yet Americans took them as they were willing to burn stuff down for them because of these principles I just laid out. You go to the Massachusetts State House. I hope you do go into the Massachusetts State House. If you go to the Massachusetts State House in the 1895 wing of the Massachusetts State House, as you're walking through the entrance, there is a huge central mural there. And in that mural, I would do a quiz question, see if anyone knows which mural this is. It's James Otis arguing the writs of assistance case in 1761. Where Otis argues the writs of assistance, these were writs that were offered where it gave people a chance to search and seize property without due process. And Otis got up in 1761 and said, this is against natural law, it is against the Constitution of Englishmen, it is wrong. It was the first time in the colonies that appeals to the Constitution and appeals to God and natural law should trump the dictates of Parliament. Otis lost that case. He also later went crazy, but that's a whole other story. Then, of course, you have the Stamp Act in 1765. The Stamp Act was not that big a deal. The taxes were very low. America was way taxed less than England. England just fought a war to protect the colonies. They went almost bankrupt to protect the colonies, saying, hey, you should pay just like this much. It's not that big a deal in England. They're like, why are these colonists going bananas over this? Because of all the things I just laid out. This was a violation of the English Constitution. They did not have a say in the levy of taxes. Therefore, it is an example of tyranny. Because if we let the Stamp Act go, what's next? They'll take everything. And of course, the people in England are like, this is wild. These colonists are wild. We don't want everything. We just want a little bit of money to pay our debts. And then, of course, they repeal that. And then 2 years later, there's the Townshend duties. This is where I'm brushing off all your history. Townshend duties of 1767, named after Charles Townshend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. One of the big arguments after the Stamp Act was you can't levy internal taxes. That's just for our provincial assemblies. So the English come back and say, fine, we won't do that. We'll just levy taxes on imported goods, tariffs. We can do that, right? Oh, they went berserk over these tariffs. There weren't that many tariffs. This is small taxation. It's not a big deal, not oppressive at all. So the English are like, oh, we'll just do these taxes on tariffs. They're like, no. But the purpose of these taxes is to raise revenue. You can have the Navigation Acts, whose job is to regulate trade. This is to raise revenue, therefore unconstitutional. Massachusetts famously, when basically half the legislature was gone, they passed a circular letter in early 1768 opposing the Townshend duties. And then the English get really annoyed by this. They say, you have to rescind this circular letter. And then the Massachusetts people get together and they overwhelmingly say, no, we're not. We're going to keep it. One of the big issues in 1768, I still love this stuff. I love this stuff. This is too much. So one of the problems in Boston is that there was no police department. They had constables. And the constables were elected by the town meeting. So when you had situations where these customs officials were there and these Bostonians, these Sons of Liberty, would tar and feather them or cause endless problems, and the governor would be like, you've got to put these people in jail. And the constables were like, which people? I don't see any people. Because they're accountable to the people who elected them, not to Francis Bernard. One of the issues in the Townshend duties, going back to the constitutional rights, they set up a board of customs commissioners actually based in Boston who would be paid for by this revenue. Because you'd have local customs officials who'd be paid off by the Bostonians and they'd be like, smuggling? I don't see any smuggling. So the English are like, we're just trying to enforce the laws. And the Bostonians are like, this is our constitutional rights being violated. The Vice Admiralty courts were another part of the Townshend duties. And this is where these customs violations would go before these Vice Admiralty courts, and the courts would get money if they successfully convicted them. And boy, people weren't happy about that. So Francis Bernard asked for troops to try and enforce the law. And so in 1768, British troops showed up in Boston, really just to be a police force. But of course, this is a standing army. This is the worst thing ever. People are furious. Sam Adams was just even making up stories. I mean, Sam Adams literally had to be told by his fellow patriots, stop lying. Because he would make up these stories about what the British troops were doing in Boston and then not distribute them in Boston, but send them to other colonies. And then the people in Boston are like, we know you're writing this. Because he was writing in a pseudonym. It's like, we know you're writing this. This is not true. You should stop doing this. But he hated this notion of a standing army. And so, of course, that led to the Boston Massacre in 1770. After that, the troops were moved out of Boston to Castle Island. And everything was sort of okay until the Tea Act of 1773. Then the Great Tea Party in December, where, of course, where did they meet before they dumped the tea in the harbor? Old South Church in Boston. Yeah. Go Congregationalist. And the British were just furious. The tax on tea, I'm sure you know this. The tax on tea, one of the things it did is it lowered the cost of tea. They gave a break to the East India Company, British East India Company, where they didn't have to pay certain re-export duties out of England, so that the actual tea cost in Boston with the tax would be cheaper than Dutch tea and other tea that was available. And so the Bostonians knew that people would buy the cheaper tea because, people buy cheap things that are cheaper. And so in order to prevent the tea from going on the market, they had to dump it in the harbor, because otherwise the tax would be paid. And the English are like, you're getting cheaper tea. You people are wild. Hence the Intolerable Acts of 1774, which then leads to the start of this. But one of the things was, you look at someone like Sam Adams, he was a diehard Congregationalist, member of Old South Church in Boston. He was a deacon of the church. And for someone like Sam Adams, he looks around at some of the folks that he sees and some of the trends in society, and his big concern was the lack of virtue. He was like, what happened to the good old congregational days? Our virtue has been declining. It's been declining because of all this wealth and materialism and corruption that we see. He wants to get back to those early days where people were more virtuous. These are the things that led to the American Revolution. And it comes down to these principles that people held dear. And so one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, how do we embody some of these principles for ourselves today? Now, I've said many times, and I'm like a broken record on this, I think that like church is the answer to all of society's ills. Name the ill in society. What's the answer? More church. I'm a little biased, but I do believe that's true. So for instance, one of the great values of the revolution was liberty. There is no denomination in the United States that cares more about liberty historically than the Congregationalists. We literally could have a banner out front being like, we are the denomination of liberty. But it's liberty as conceived of back in the revolutionary period. Congregationalists are all about freedom of conscience. No one is going to tell you what to believe. We want you to think for yourself. That is instrumental to what we mean by liberty and what they meant by liberty. This is why the first public education act in the world was here in Massachusetts. People have to think for themselves. This is one of the reasons why I detest the excess of money in politics today, because it deprives us of our liberty. This is why I detest all the algorithms that you see in all these various social media things. They deprive us of our liberty. They help manipulate the way we think things. I want you to think for yourself, to get as much information as possible. That's what Congregationalists are all about. And liberty, back in those days, is not liberty to do whatever you want. It's liberty to decide what to do in community. It was a very communal notion of liberty. So they're like, a violation of liberty, we don't want people in England telling us how to tax ourselves. We'll decide for ourselves how to tax ourselves in community. And part of that expression of liberty in this revolutionary sense, in this congregational sense, is being involved. Now, this is where I'm going to get myself in trouble, but well, it's not the first time. In order for us to be a community that values liberty, real liberty, communal liberty, freedom of thought, we need to have everyone in our community involved in discussions. When we discuss big issues of the day, we need everyone involved in those discussions. One of the disturbing trends in the congregation that I don't like is that when we talk about things that might be tricky, a lot of conservatives in the congregation feel that they're not welcomed and don't show up. That is not a good expression of liberty. I want this to be a congregation of liberty where everyone's voice, no matter what your views are, is welcomed here, feels welcomed here, and we can engage as a community. That's liberty. That's what it means. I want people to show up when we're discussing important issues. I also don't want us to feel muzzled if we want to talk about issues that have moral import in our society. I am not a politician, thank God. I don't actually care that much about public policy, but I do care about morality. And that is part of my job. So when we see moral things happening in society, I want us to be able to talk about that as a congregation, as a whole congregation. I don't care what government program provides health care for people. I don't care. I don't care how we do it. I don't care about the ACA. I don't care about Medicaid. I don't care about Medicare. I don't care about those things in the least. You know what I do care about? People have health care. That's what I care about. That's a moral issue. We should all care about that. I'm not hung up on one particular side of the aisle or anything. I'm hung up on the morality of these things. I don't care that USAID is being changed. Fine. What I care about is that 14 million people, according to Lancet, might die because of those changes, and we haven't figured out a way to make sure that they don't. I'm not pushing one particular agenda. I'm pushing one particular morality, and that morality is Christian. And I want us all involved in these conversations. That's liberty. That's what happened back in those days. People discussed things. They respected each other's opinions and each other's consciousness. That's important. Churches need to model that. Our ancestors did. Another thing is this celebration of virtue. Again and again in the revolutionary era, there was a sense that virtue was declining. And we see that all over America today. An excess of materialism and all the negative things that come from that. people not being honest and truthful, people not being kind, people not listening to others. These are values and virtues that we need as a democracy to thrive and succeed, and they knew that in the 18th century, and they talked about it all the time. We need virtuous people for a democracy. Democracy does not always succeed in other countries. Why? Because you don't have the fabric of people there, willing to set aside their self-interest for the greater good, willing to engage in these conversations. That is virtue. Churches teach virtue. Congregational churches teach virtue. All you kids that are here, that virtue is important. That's why you're here, to learn about that, to be good, virtuous citizens. That's what we do. Corruption of power affects everybody. And there have to be voices that stand up against it. We need more courage in society. That courage is a dearly held virtue. But not only do we need to embrace liberty and also develop virtue, we also need to still maintain hope. The text that Kelly read earlier is a text that comes from the final part of Isaiah. And depending on when it's dated, it's sometimes dated either just before the return from exile or immediately after the return from the Babylonian captivity. They got back and things were not good. But the prophet who takes the name of Isaiah at the time is like, yes, but if we are a virtuous people, God will be there and we will be able to rejoice. We have to have hope that if we do the right thing as a nation, we do the right thing as a people, we do the right thing as a congregation, God is working out there, and we will be able to rejoice. But we have to commit to those values that are so core to who we are as a nation. And so on this weekend, that's what I'm committing to. And I hope you can join me in that. I love our country. I love this nation. I'm not going to give up on this nation, not now, not ever. I'm going to lean into these values that my faith teaches me. And I want us to do it together.